So this morning we pick up the story of Exodus, and we've had a bit of a time outside of this story looking at the Easter story, and we're dipping back in now. So a bit of a recap: we've had Moses being sent by God to rescue the Israelite people from slavery in Egypt. And we know that there's been the plagues. We know that Pharaoh has resisted the call to let his people go, but eventually, after the Passover, he says to the people, go. But on their way, he changes their mind. And it's at the Red Sea, where it looks like the Israelites have been cornered, that finally God, in a miraculous way, brings them through the Red Sea. And the last sermon we had on this was Miriam's song of praise and thanksgiving to God for his deliverance and his miraculous saving power in their lives. So it's interesting that just a few weeks later from that encounter at the Red Sea, we come to the Israelites not in quite the same sense of thanksgiving and praise as when we left them, but instead they're moaning. So they've been brought out of Egypt into the wilderness, and we know that for 40 years they're in the wilderness, roaming around. God is shaping them and training them and moving them. The wilderness is a difficult time. It's a place which is unfamiliar to them. The Israelites have never lived in the wilderness before. They've lived in Egypt. They're familiar with their customs. They're familiar with their way of life. So they're brought into a land which is completely unfamiliar. But not only that, they're also stripped of all their basic necessities, the things that they're used to. And beyond that, there's an existential crisis. They're asking the question, are we even going to survive this? Are we going to survive? And so I wonder if some of those experiences of the Israelites in the wilderness maybe chime with where we are today, that we're in an unfamiliar place. We're experiencing things that we haven't experienced before. And maybe we feel like we are being stripped back to the basics, to a much more simple life than what we're used to. And maybe there is even that question, are things ever going to be the same? Are we going to be okay? Are we going to survive this? And so I want to suggest that the wilderness experience that the Israelites have maybe reflects something of what we're experiencing today. But for God, in God's wisdom, he decided to keep the Israelites in the wilderness for 40 years for good reason. He needed to get the slavery mentality out of them before they were able to enter the promised land. And this time in the wilderness is God demonstrating to the Israelites who he is and who they are under his care. And so perhaps for us as well, this might be our experience, that during this time that God might be wanting to show us more clearly who he is and who we are in relation to him. So I'm going to read now from Exodus chapter 16, and we're not going to read the whole of it, but we're going to read verses 1 to 5 and then verses 13 to 33. So the whole Israelite community set out from Elim, which was a kind of oasis where they'd had some water and had some rest, and they came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt, so about 6 weeks later. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and will see whether they follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gathered on the other days." Then down to verse 13. So that evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is this?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." The Israelites did what they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it out by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, "Do not keep any of it until the morning. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person, and the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you're to gather, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any." Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the 7th day. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was like white coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." So Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it, then place it before the Lord to be kept for generations to come." So there are 3 things from this passage that I want to reflect on. The first is the grumbling. The second is the provision of manna. And the third is the Sabbath instruction. So let's start off with the grumbling. What I didn't include there were various other verses where it just talks continually about the grumbling of the Israelite people. In fact, 7 times in 11 verses, it talks about their grumbling. I don't know about you, but discomfort tends to make me grumble as well. It doesn't bring out the best in me. So times when I'm tired, times when I'm hungry, if I'm in pain, maybe if I'm scared, all these sorts of emotions that I don't like to see in myself tend to rise to the surface. I don't know if you've seen that Snickers advert where the whole premise is if you get hungry, then you turn into a diva. And essentially that's what's happening to the Israelite people here. They're hungry and they're fed up. And all the kind of muck and the emotions that maybe they would like to hide have come to the surface. And I want to suggest that might be what's happening with us in this wilderness time. I don't know if you've experienced any of this grumbling yourself, or even maybe more than that, some meltdowns perhaps. And if you want to know anything about meltdowns, you just need to look at the Israelites and Moses. What it doesn't record here, but it does record in Numbers chapter 11, is how things have escalated from some grumbling to full meltdown mode. So the Israelites are then not just grumbling, complaining, but they are wailing, talking about the times when they remember fish and cucumbers and melons, and the times when they had leeks and garlic and onions. And it says that there was a person from every family standing at the tent door of every tent, wailing, asking Moses for these things, asking for meat. So you can see things have got a bit out of hand. These grumblings and complaints have really turned into something serious. But it's not just the people, it's also Moses. So Moses' response to the complaints also constitutes a meltdown, where he says to God, "Did I conceive these people? Did I give them birth? Is this how you're going to treat me, God? If it's how you're going to treat me, I would rather you just killed me now." So I don't know if this kind of melodrama reflects anything going on possibly in your household. Hopefully nothing to that extent. But the reality is that when we're in this hard place, when we're in a wilderness, when we're in unfamiliar surroundings and we're scared and maybe we're hungry and we're tired, it can bring up some really unpleasant emotions. And perhaps part of the problem here is that the Israelites forgotten just what God has already given them. that their eyes are trained on what they don't have. They don't have the fish, they don't have the cucumbers and melons, they don't have the meat that they want. But what they do have is freedom. What they do have is liberation from a tyrant. What they do have is God now as their guardian. And it's like they've completely forgotten that. They've completely forgotten the good things, the blessings that they've already received, and all they can focus on and obsess about are the things that they don't have. And so I just want to humbly offer that as maybe a remedy for us when we're feeling those emotions and complaints bubbling to the surface, maybe just to allow our focus to turn from the things we don't have to the things that we do have. I want to move on now to talk about a couple of things that God has given the Israelites in this place. And they're not just gifts that he gives them, but they also kind of serve as tests as well for the Israelite people. The first of these is manna. So we know it's miraculous provision, that it's literally bread from heaven that is rained down after the dew melts away. It's left with these flakes. It says it's a bit like coriander seeds. In other places it says it's a bit like resin, a kind of sweet tasting substance which gets mashed up into a paste, which the people eat for 40 years. So there isn't much variety in their diet, but the reality is that they are sustained by God in a miraculous way for 40 years. Every single day, apart from the seventh day, when they gather on the sixth day, ready for the seventh day, there is this consistency in God's provision. And in verse 12 of this chapter, it says, it's God himself saying, "Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. When you see this provision, then you will know for sure who I am." And this is in stark contrast to Pharaoh. So they've been living under Pharaoh's reign and rule for centuries. And he is capricious. He changes. So one day he's making them make bricks with straw, and the next day saying, "You're not going to have any straw to make your bricks." And then we know that he says, "You can go off into the wilderness and you can leave." And then he changes his mind. And so they're used to living under the rule of a sort of godlike character who constantly changes. But in the wilderness, God is teaching them with his consistent provision. He's saying, "You can trust me. I'm not going to change. I am faithful. I am steadfast." And he really kind of pushes the Israelites to their limits in trusting him. So we know that they went for 3 days without water. But it's like he's wanting to instill in them that he is their sustainer, he is their provider, he is their guardian, and he can be relied upon. But it's amazing, isn't it, how quickly they have forgotten how good God is, that within 6 weeks they've forgotten the provision of God through the miraculous exodus from Egypt. And I was just thinking that this is the same for us, that we really quickly forget God's good work in our life and his provision. I was reminded of a story in Mark where Jesus gets pretty annoyed with his disciples because very recently he has performed the miraculous multiplication of food at the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And then he hears his followers having a discussion about how they're hungry and haven't brought any bread. And so just let me read from Mark chapter 8. He says, aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, or ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up then?" 7, they replied. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" And so we see the disciples there. They've had this track record of Jesus multiplying and providing, and still they are slow to trust in his provision and so quick to forget his past provision for them. And isn't that the same for us? We're slow to believe in God's provision for us, and we are quick to forget how he's provided for us in the past. And that's where the jar of manna comes in. You know, at the end of that passage, God tells Moses, who then tells Aaron, to get an omer of manna and to put it in a jar and to keep that as a kind of reference point for future generations, to say this is when God provided for us in miraculous ways. And it was there to serve as a reminder to those future generations who hadn't experienced it themselves. And as I've been reflecting on this, I've been thinking this is a time for us to be doing the same thing. Whether that's getting a literal jar or box and reminding ourselves, writing down times when God has been faithful and putting those in a box, or whether it's just retelling stories of God's goodness and faithfulness to us, recalling the times when God has sustained us through uncertain circumstances, whether that's his sustaining presence in terms of material provision or emotional or spiritual, but that we've all got stories of how God has provided for us. And now is the time to be passing on those stories to younger generations and to be telling them to one another, because that helps us to stand firm in the belief and the understanding that God will provide for us in these uncertain circumstances. And the final thing I want to talk about is Sabbath. So after hundreds of years in slavery, working 7 days a week, 365 days a year, God gives the Israelites a day off. He gives them the seventh day to rest, the Sabbath. And there's different reasons for why he's instituted this, but in Deuteronomy it tells us that it's so that they remember they're no longer slaves, but they are the people of God, that their identity has shifted. And in Exodus, in the giving of the Ten Commandments, it's the reason given behind the Sabbath is that God rested on the seventh day. And so as people made in his image and patterning their lives after him, that they should also rest on the seventh day. But both of those reasons are true, and they both come to the core identity of who the people are, that God is teaching them in the wilderness who they are, that they are the children of God. They're no longer slaves. They are children, they're sons, they're daughters, they're his people, and that they are made in his image, made to reflect him and glorify him. And we can see that this is not just an idea that God puts out there for the Israelites to enjoy a day off. It's an instruction. They are told to do it, and it's confirmed by the fact that God's provision follows what he has instructed, that there is no extra food on the seventh day. Even if they go out looking for it, it's just not there, because he's serious about Sabbath. He is serious about them resting. He is serious about them living out their true identity as sons and daughters. And I want to suggest that for us, that we in this wilderness season also take seriously the call to Sabbath. And there we can be very easily like these Israelites who just pop out on the seventh day and think, oh, is there something here for me to provide for my family or provide for my needs? And that for us isn't looking for manna, but it could be checking our emails or doing some extra housework or doing the tasks of the week that haven't got done. It's so easy to fall back into that mode where we're trying to provide for ourselves. But it takes enormous courage to trust that we don't run the world, that our provision and our family's well-being does not rely upon me, but it relies upon God. And God is saying, you're not responsible for providing for your family. I am. And the world does not rely on you keeping it going. It relies on me. And by us observing a Sabbath, that is essentially us entrusting our lives and our families to God's care in quite a radical and quite scary way. And if you want to know more about Sabbath, I just recommend a couple of great books, Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, which we know very well, and another more recent book, which is called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. They're both great books looking at this idea of Sabbath. But essentially, it's the idea that 24 hours of a week, we stop, we rest, we worship, and we delight in God and in his good creation. Those are the four ingredients. So stopping, resting, worshipping, and delighting. And I want to invite you and your household to kind of experiment with this idea of Sabbath. What does Sabbath look like for you in this lockdown? But as we do that and as we pursue it, it is a sign of our trust and our reliance on God. So I hope that you can see from this passage that God's intention in the wilderness was to train his people, to demonstrate who he is and who they are under his care and protection. And so may we, in this wilderness period, be like the Israelites, ready to see who God truly is and who we are in relation to him. May we be people who don't grumble, but instead are thankful for the things that we do have, rather than obsessing about the things that we don't have. May we be those who stand firm in our trust in God's provision, and those who commit ourselves to Sabbathing, to living out and reflecting the image of our good God. Amen.